Welcome back to Power and Purpose. I'm Amanda Sloat.
And I'm Nathalie Tocci.
We are delighted to welcome Laura Chinchilla, who served as president of Costa Rica from 2010 to 2014. She's had a distinguished career, including heading several government ministries, consulting for United Nations agencies, and teaching at universities. Today, we'll be discussing the situation in Venezuela and Latin America, as well as the ups and downs of serving as the first female president of her country. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Nathalie. It is a great pleasure to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Laura. And beginning with foreign policy, we know that the US administration seems to be determined to establish its sphere of influence in the quote-unquote Western Hemisphere. And of course, this project really seems to be focused to a large extent, I mean, not exclusively, but to a large extent on Latin America. Of course, the attack on Venezuela was the first and foremost case in this attempt at re-establishing or establishing a sphere of influence. So I'm wondering if you could give us your take on actually how you see the situation in Venezuela, and in particular, whether you see what has happened, i.e. the removal of Nicolás Maduro, as being the move that A, opens to a real transition, B, is simply a decapitation of a regime that basically leaves the situation kind of unchanged, or C, may actually end up in a wider destabilization, not just of Venezuela, but possibly more broadly of your region.
Thank you. Certainly, there are important changes considering the new security strategy that was announced by Donald Trump by the end of last year. However, in Latin America, we had already experienced, before the announcement of that strategy, some very significant actions. I would say that the most relevant was the enormous presence of military power in Southern Caribbean, basically based on the justification that it was necessary to confront the drug cartels and to stop the flowing of cocaine to the United States. However, as it was very clear later on, the main reason was to take Maduro out of the country and also to start doing something about a more effective control on the oil reserves and production in Venezuela. It is very hard to say what is next for Venezuela. The deterioration that Venezuela suffered, which basically impacted the economy, created the most important humanitarian crisis in our hemisphere, and finally totally eliminated any kind of democratic instrument and institutions. So it was very clear that something will happen in Venezuela. And the second thing is that the international instruments were not able to provide an effective response. I remember, for example, the former Secretary General of the Organization of American States calling many times for invoking the democratic charter to be applied to Venezuela. I remember at least 6 times when the democratic opponents decided or accepted a new negotiation in order to guarantee a peaceful transition in Venezuela, and nothing happened. So what I want to say, I don't justify the use of force, but it is important to recognize that if we do not do something about what is happening with the rule-based order at the global and regional level, we will be providing more and more reasons for those eager to use unilateral responses to continue using them to respond to many of the problems that we are confronted today.
But can I press you a little bit on this point? Because I think you make a really powerful point there of basically saying, well, we obviously don't agree with the method used, but we have to recognize that alternatives methods had not delivered. Anyway, we are where we are now. And I think we're still left with this open question mark. Is this simply going to be actually the same regime, simply with a different figurehead, or is it actually going to lead to a real transition? Turning the same question, but to the present, what is it that the international community, obviously alongside the US, if it wants to work with them, should be doing in order to ensure that it is not simply the same regime with a different head and with all resources going to the United States, and for the rest, it's all the same?
Yes, exactly. It is very hard, again, to try to predict the future in Venezuela. But what is true is that when you ask the Venezuelans today, they are happier today than they were 3 months ago. At least I will say that two things are happening. Number one, of course, you have probably the worst faces still in Venezuela. I'm referring especially to Diosdado Cabello, or to Padrino, who is the chief of the armed forces. They are still there, but it is very obvious that they have lost power. In a certain way, they are becoming a kind of puppet that are obeying some of the orders provided by United States representatives. And the second thing is that they had liberated many prisoners. It is not enough. It is only about 20 to 25% of the people who are still in jail, but that is something. It was interesting because the Economist ran a survey asking the Venezuelans how they feel now. Donald Trump has become the more popular guy in Venezuela, even more popular than Maria Corina Machado. So what I think should be done, I think that those regional powers that we still have, like Brazil and Mexico, should not only call for something different, but should act, should do something to help to make a more effective pressure in order to get a peaceful transition to democracy. And finally, I think that probably President Trump will also need to find out that without other kind of leadership in Venezuela, it's going to be very hard for him to get the amount of investment that he is calling from the corporate sector. It is very clear that the only way that the corporate sector will come back to Venezuela to invest in oil will be only if they can get certainty, and that is only provided by a strong rule of law and democracy. If it doesn't happen, I think that we will continue with something in between, which is very bad for Venezuela.
Yeah, and they've given very clear signals to that effect as well.
Right.
Let me pick up on the idea of democracy and zoom out a bit from Venezuela to Latin America. Throughout your government career as president, you also served as Minister of Justice, Minister of Public Security, and I know you've worked a lot on security threats to the region and have talked in particular about organized crime and drug trafficking. So Trump is not wrong in his broader analysis about the risks of drug trafficking coming to the U.S., of course, to Venezuela. It's much more to Europe. And then really the challenges posed by organized crime in a number of these countries connected to that and also complicating governance. And as you said, for the people of Venezuela, part of the reason they supported what Trump did is they feel like they tried everything else through democratic and other means to deal with the regime that they were facing. So I'm interested, based on your very practical experience in government working on these things, what is creating some of these challenges? Why is it such a struggle for governments in Latin America to get a handle on organized crime and drug trafficking? And are there things that the United States and other countries could do to help in a way that's perhaps more legally oriented than what we have seen with Venezuela?
Of course, I would say that organized crime is the main risk that we are confronting in this region from the point of view of the destabilizing effect that they are creating on our institutions. The number one is cocaine. Producing cocaine, we have the three main producers in our region: Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. But also that during the last years, the criminal gangs, the drug cartels, were able to diversify the illegal activities. So now you do not only have the illegal drug market, but you also have arms, you also have the kind of environmental crimes, you also have crimes related to the exploitation of persons. So it's getting harder and harder to fight those criminal organizations. At the same time, we need to recognize that, unfortunately, Latin America has not the best record in tackling corruption.
Right.
And when you have so weak kind of institutions with high levels of corruption and inefficiency, they become a perfect target for the criminal gangs. Now, is the response that the United States government providing the right one? I will say that on one hand, we should recognize that they are putting the focus on this issue. Number two, they are bringing more resources to combat the drug cartels and the criminal organizations. But also there are some concerns. For example, if we basically decide to militarize the war on drugs, I am very afraid that it will displace the law enforcement agencies. It will also debilitate the cooperation with other nations. For example, the United Kingdom and Netherlands already announced that they do not want with the cooperation they had in the Caribbean. For obvious reasons, they are very concerned about the use of the military force.
I mean, we want to move on to you, but I just wanted to sort of squeeze in because essentially what you're saying is, okay, fine, there was obviously a problem. The United States is providing a certain kind of unilateral and militarized solution, but ultimately this is also because of a broader problem that we have in multilateral cooperation that has not been able to deliver. And I wanted to relate this point to the much wider and broader and perhaps deeper problem that is afflicting precisely the multilateral system, and in particular the UN system, where basically you have a UN which is being defunded, in which decision-making has been blocked for a long time, if we think about the Security Council, and in which, just think about not just the Venezuela attack, but even now, in a sense, the constitution of the Board of Peace, there is not simply a violation of the law, which, frankly speaking, it's not the first time and it will not be the last. There is an ignoring of the law. There's an ignoring of existing institutions. There's a deliberate attempt to put them to one side. And so if we are to recognize, as the Canadian Prime Minister Mike Carney did in Davos, that there is a rupture in the system, that the old system is gone, what do you think should be the principles of an alternative multilateral system?
That's just the squeeze in easy question.
I think that this speech of Prime Minister Carney at Davos was a kind of probably wake-up call for many in the world, many leaders in the world. Probably they already knew what was happening, but they were not willing to express in such kind of sincere way. And it is hard not to agree with his diagnosis. So the question is, how do we move forward? I don't think that this is a matter of changing the values. I don't think this is a matter of changing the principles that had sustained the rule-based order at a national level like democracy, or the rules-based order at an international level like the multilateral institutions. I think that the values and the principles should be the same. We have failed in the instruments, in the means to guarantee that we were going to protect those values and principles, but at the same time that we were going to react on time. I mean, that we were going to respond timely to people's demands, to nation needs, to the different groups that are demanding solutions and responses to their problems. So right now, the discussion, that's my point of view, shouldn't be about distracting ourselves with the values of the principles. Totally the contrary. We need to reaffirm those principles. Look, I also remember a very important response that President Trump gave when someone asked him, do you have limits in taking your decisions when it comes to the international order? And what he said was something very simple, but very scary at the same time. Because what he said is the rules don't apply to me. The only limit that I have is my own moral. So if the moral is going to be the limit, we need to recognize that it is more important now than ever to invest in principles and values so the new leaders have the right moral.
Well, instead of talking about the world according to Trump, we want to spend a little bit of time now talking about the world according to Laura. And I'm always very interested in people's origin stories, especially people that work in public service. I understand your father's government job first introduced you to public service. And as Natalie and I are both big travelers, I understand that you did a trip throughout Central America when you were 18, that you've said inspired your interest in political science. So take us back to those years and describe a little bit what sparked your interest in government work and public service work, and especially what it was about traveling in Central America that really solidified that for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing that very important part of my life, because in certain way, yes, I had many sources of inspiration when I decided to get involved in public service, and probably number one was my father, because he was a public servant for many years, and I love to listen to him with all the experiences and challenges he was confronting. I needed something else. I needed kind of more decisive source of inspiration in terms of, yes, well, it is important to serve your country, but why me? What kind of difference can I do? And at that time, probably the audience doesn't know that Costa Rica is the oldest uninterrupted democracy in Latin America. We are among the 25 full democracies in the world. So I was very lucky to be born in this country, because I never experienced, I never understood. It was very hard to understand what was this about the military rule in most of the Latin American countries at that time. And so I was very curious about, what is this? What is living without democracy? Because at that time, also Costa Rica, when I was young, we were receiving many people from different countries in Latin America, in Central America, that they were fleeing from repression. I decided to organize myself to travel along Central America. And those were very dangerous years, because most of the nations were experiencing civil wars.
Did you travel alone?
I traveled totally alone, totally alone.
Your father, your parents thought that was a good idea for an 18-year-old girl alone in dangerous countries?
I already had 18 years old, so I was not obliged to ask their permission for leaving the country, but I didn't want to give them the information well in advance, because I was sure that they were going to do something to interrupt my plans. So
Yours was a preemptive strike there.
yes, exactly. I also need to say that I had to find a job so I can have at least the money to finance my trip. And it was a very cheap trip, using public services, buses, and sleeping in whatever place I can pay. But let me tell you that what I saw in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which were the four countries that I visited at that time, was really, really transformative. Because in El Salvador, for example, when I arrived, the guerrilla was opening a fire in the city. I remember that we stayed at the bus station for 2 nights before the army was able to control that situation. In Nicaragua, they had already overthrew the Somoza dictatorship, but the situation was still very confused with the Sandinistas arriving to take the power. And in Honduras, it was probably the most scary situation because I was interviewed by the military at the frontier because one of the books I was reading was very crazy. And in Guatemala, you can feel the fear coming from the population to speak freely about what was happening. I decided when I came back to Costa Rica, I decided first, I survived, which is very obvious. I survived.
Sure, your parents were very thankful.
Yes. And secondly, my conclusion was, yes, I can make a difference in avoiding that Costa Rica follow the same path of authoritarianism and militarization that our neighborhoods had followed.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
And to be honest, Laura, I'm no Latin America expert, but you honestly look especially at Central America and you look at Costa Rica and the contrast with all other countries, and it's really quite striking. But that your travels there brought me back to some of my memories. As soon as I finished university, I went on a very long trip in the Middle East. And of course, it was,
Wonderful.
still the day in which you could actually go to most countries in the region. Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and that had
Very, very dangerous countries too.
yeah, and it had such a massive impact on what I did afterwards.
Yes.
So, to all
Yes.
of our listeners, travel is.
Go travel everywhere.
But coming back to you, Laura, after your studies, and you had a brief stint in the NGO sector, and then you sort of jumped into politics. And in politics, you held various positions. You were vice minister, you were minister for public security, you were a congresswoman, you were vice president, and of course, you were then president of Costa Rica. And if one kind of looks at this movie, and of course, it feels like an incredibly wow movie, there's a progression step by step. And I assume it is probably not as linear as what it reads like. But if you were to sort of think back at that journey, what would you say were the main things that you carried with you as you moved from one step to the other? What were the lessons learned?
Look, I try to be very consistent in especially my commitment with integrity. Because when you analyze why the people, one of the main reasons why the people feel disenfranchised with politics has to do with corruption, especially here in our countries in Latin America. So I made that promise also because my father was, for many years, he was in charge of especially controlling corruption in public sector. He was the head of the, I don't know, how do you call in your countries? In the United States, I think is the General Accounting Office, which is basically monitoring the correct use of public funding. So I heard many, many, many negative stories about how public servants were using in a bad manner the public resources. So I think that was probably number one. I mean, I tried to, and that is why I think that when people elected me, they have no doubts about that part of my public career. Probably, there were some controversies about some policy issues that I embraced, but not necessarily about the ethical kind of issues. And even today, let me tell you that, I needed to get involved again in politics here in Costa Rica during this campaign because we are going through a very special campaign. Most of the democratic forces are trying to position our concern about one of the alternatives that are trying to continue in power, and they have a very authoritarian approach to power. And I have been very open in speaking against, the risk that this alternative entails for Costa Rica. And they have tried to find any way to intimidate me. And they have not found anything during my public life to be used against me. When you are loyal to your values, you can become a more powerful person.
You cannot be blackmailed.
You put in the very well. Yes, exactly.
So you are the first head of state or government that we have had on our podcast, and we're very honored that you agreed to join us. What is that experience like to be president? When you were an 18-year-old girl on a bus in Nicaragua, did you think someday I'm going to be president? And how did you find the experience? What was the best part of it? What were the biggest frustrations of it?
When people ask me if I had this aspiration of becoming president of Costa Rica since I was a child, I say that it was impossible for a girl at that time to imagine that they can become president of a country, prime minister, because they were not prime ministers or presidents at that time when I was born. And in fact, I had to make a kind of exercise to better explain what I'm saying. And that was that I went to Google and I wrote the year when I was born, 1959, and I confirmed the following, and that is that all the different relevant events that they registered for 1959, there were only two relevant events that were mentioned with a woman's name. One was Indira Gandhi, because in that year she became the president of his political party, years after she became the first prime minister of India. And the second name, you won't believe it. It was like, there were no women at all in 1959. The second relevant name that was mentioned was Barbie.
Oh my God.
Exactly, because Barbie was born the same year in which I was born. Of course, she still kept very beautiful and young. It was impossible for a girl to dream about becoming a head of a state. Well, finally, when I started getting involved in politics, the situation started changing here in Costa Rica and in many countries. I had the opportunity to become the first president in my country. And I could mention probably many things I feel proud about in terms of my achievements. But I believe that my major accomplishment was to break the glass ceilings in politics.
Yeah.
The impact this event had on Costa Rican girls, especially, was instrumental in changing their perspective about power.
Yeah.
If that was your proudest moment, what would you say was your most difficult moment, or the thing that you considered to be actually more of a failure?
It is hard to mention a single kind of event. My presidency was not easy at all because I had to take one of the most controversial decisions that any politician can make in those countries, and that was how to balance the fiscal deficit that we had at that time. And nobody wants to pay more taxes. But at the same time, nobody also wants to sacrifice their privileges. So the combination of those very controversial decisions mobilized many sectors against me, against power, against the presidency. And for me, that was not something new. I know that power is about confronting constantly, every day, the different coming from different groups. But I would say that basically it was very hard to see how easily the balance in the information is lost in a democracy. Now it seems very easy to understand when we have, a very obvious predominance of negative and disinformation kind of environment. But at that time, it was a little different. Social media, yes, I already had social media when I was president, but it didn't have the power that they have today. But even traditional media were not able to keep the balance, and it was very strong to experience that imbalance.
I think your point on role models is so important. Natalie, I don't think I ever told you this. When I was little in grade school, and people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I used to say I wanted to be the first woman president of the United States.
Fantastic.
I want to be part of your campaign.
I vote for Sloat. My friends have the campaign slogan ready. And it's funny looking back, I didn't say I wanted to be president, but even at that age when I was 8, the aspiration was not just to be president, but there was this sense that it was going to take many, many years for there to be a woman president, which is still so many years away. So I'm curious for you, your views on women in leadership. Are there traits that you found that women bring to these offices that are different? And what you say to people is the benefit beyond just diversity of having more women in these senior leadership roles?
Look, yes, I think there are differences, and there are some positive differences in favor of female leaders. And I will mention at least two of them. Of course, they are not exclusive of female leaders, but they are predominant among them. One is integrity. I think it is harder to find negative cases of women manipulating public resources or using them in an illegal way. Integrity in general, I think, is a feature of women leaders, both in public but also in private sector and social sectors. But one which is very important, taking into account what is happening today almost worldwide with the new type of leadership, political leadership, women have a less arrogant approach to power. And that is something important because power is not an end in itself. It is a tool. It is a tool for helping others to improve their quality of life. It is a tool to serve the people. Let me give you an example. When we experienced the pandemic, we saw many different approaches in terms of how to deal with the crisis. And it was very clear at that time that almost 100% of the governments that were leading by women did a very good job, while it was not the case with the rest of the governments that were leading by men. And one of the most important reasons was that precisely since women are less arrogant to power, they were able to conform policies according to science and the advice of the expertise, because that was an special crisis when presidents and head of states needed to understand that it was not about them. It was about protecting the health of the people. And in order to do that, you need to invite the scientists to take decisions with you. In those situations where presidents denied the importance of science, in those situations where presidents thought that scientists were competing with them in taking decisions, the situation was terrible.
No, I think that's excellent. And yes, to have leaders who respect science is very important. Well, we've talked a lot on this podcast as well about work-life balance. And you had a long series of very demanding and stressful jobs. So interested if you have any lessons learned or tips or ways that you found to stay healthy and sane, quite frankly, in these very demanding positions.
The first thing is, again, I'm going back to something that I said before, is to behave according to your principles, according to your values, because that makes the difference in terms of being able to feel good about yourself. And you can sleep relatively well when you wake up every day and you say, yeah, probably could have taken another decision. Probably that decision had been more popular, but that decision was not correct. That is something that is important. And secondly, let me tell you, yes, governing a country is a very demanding kind of job. There are many complex situations that you confront, but there are many, many, many very beautiful also moments that you experience. So if you have the opportunity to go out, to share with the people in the streets, to listen to them, you will find out there are many people who believes in what you are doing. There are many people who are also experiencing the benefits of some of your decisions, but also people who can tell you, look, I think you are wrong, but in a very respectful way. Contacting with people, sharing with people helps a lot.
I love that.
And Laura, you have done actually quite a lot of teaching yourself. You've taught in Mexico, in Brazil, and the United States. And so you've obviously had a lot of exposure to young people, both in universities and, as you were just saying now, by getting out there in the streets, meeting lots of people. I think you brought home this incredibly powerful point about integrity. Alongside this, what do you feel is, if you want to give our younger listeners sort of one piece of advice moving forward, what would that be?
To tell them that public service presents an extraordinary opportunity to serve the community and address the needs of those who require assistance the most. To effectively meet citizens' demands and expectations, public servants must embody empathy. That is something important, sensitivity towards the challenges they face, the needs they are having. And also, there are two other kind of conditions that are important. One has to do with vision, having at least something that can enable them to set realistic goals that aim to transcend immediate concerns and positively influence the future generations, but also passion. Passion because, taking decisions when you have power is something very hard. But at the same time, if you feel passionate about that, you will resist any kind of obstacle that you can confront. But believe me, if you decide to dedicate part of your professional experience or your whole career to public service, you will never be bored. I can bet about this.
That is definitely true. That is definitely true. Well, Laura, this has been such a delightful conversation. I could spend the rest of the day talking to you, but I know you and our listeners have other things to do with their day, so we'll reluctantly bring this to a close. But Nathalie and I always like to end on a positive note, although you frankly have been extremely positive throughout. There's so much darkness and challenges in.
Which, by the way, is actually quite unusual these days.
That's true. You may have been one of our consistently most positive guests, which has been wonderful. So I want to end by asking you what's brought you joy in the last few days.
I would say that two things. One has to do with my personal routines, and the second one has to do with my political concerns and values. In terms of my personal routines, whenever I have the opportunity to wake up at home, my house here in Costa Rica, I feel very, very happy. This is a beautiful country, very green country. And usually I have at home the best possible coffee that you can drink.
Ah,
So
yes.
only dreaming when I'm about to sleep. Tomorrow I will wake up with this beautiful sun that we have, with this very green nature that we have, and with the best coffee in the world. That makes me very happy. And secondly,
That's a great dad, by the way. Go to Costa Rica.
Alex, you're invited to come here and have breakfast with me. I hope you can do it sometime.
I would love that. Having spent a month there a year ago working to improve my Spanish, I would definitely come back and you
Let me know.
certainly embody the pura vida of your country.
Okay, let me know, Amanda, please.
Excellent.
And the second thing is that, as I also told you, we are about to elect a new president and the Congress people who will represent us. And although there are many stress in this election because we, for first time, we have an alternative, which is, supporting its message based on attacking the checks and balances that have been critical for our democracy. Although that is something very concerning, at the same time, I can see my people, respecting the rules, resisting any kind of negative comments concerning the electoral institutions, watching all the debates that have been organized. So I think how my democracy is demonstrating that even when we are confronting this kind of challenges, people are still behaving according to the democratic values. And so that makes me also hope about the future of our democracy independently of the results.
Well, thank you, Laura. This has been truly amazing. And I guess my 3 takeaways that I will bring with me in this conversation is sort of passion, empathy, and integrity. And of course, with a good dose of hope and joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Power and Purpose is an IE Insights podcast produced in association with IE University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Production and sound design by Reptile Studios. We'll be back soon with the next episode. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Power and Purpose wherever you get your podcasts.